All right. Hello, YouTube. I hope this is working because this is the first time I did it, but I tested this earlier, so I should be live. So welcome to the Wave Pool Block of the Month, month one. So we are kicking off this block of the month. I am Sherry Shish. I am the designer of this Wave Pool block of the month. It is a confident beginner pattern. We are going to be starting with month one, which is this center block right here, this big center block. And you can kind of see that quilt behind me hanging up. It's a quilt that ends up at 72 by 84 inches, and it's going to be sewn over the course of 6 months. Month one is a pretty easy block, and it's a very large block. It's going to be the largest block that we make, but it also gives us time for those of you that don't have your pattern yet and don't have fabric to get those started and picked out. One thing that I will make mention for those of you that have a paper pattern on page 2 or the PDF pattern, I suggest printing off page 2. It gives you your fabric letters and your colors that I use in all of the graphics. You can go ahead and cut little swatches of your fabric and attach them to this piece of paper for your project, or you can label your fabric. So whatever you would like to do. I am going to be making this block in this exact color on the cover and the exact quilt behind me. So that is fabric A, which is this large square for me, fabric B with the shells, and fabric C is this darker blue. And so now we are going to start sewing. One of the very first things that I will say is I chain piece a lot. And I also web piece, and I also do a lot of stitch and flip things. So I'm trying to be as most efficient with my sewing as possible, and I will help you and give you some tips and tricks along the way. Other thing that I should also note about reading this pattern, in the general notes, I tell you to press all seams open to avoid clashing seams. So what does that mean? If you do not like having your seam allowances clash, meaning they go all in one direction, I recommend pressing this entire quilt seams open. That will guarantee you no clashing seams throughout the entire quilt top. However, if you are like me, I do not like pressing seams open all the time. And so I do have arrows, kind of pressing arrows within the pattern if you would like to do that. But just know that you may have some clashing seams. I didn't guarantee that you would not. Okay? Other thing for this quilt pattern, the first couple pages are basic sewing instructions. So how do you make your basic units? And then throughout the month, I'll be referencing those basic units in the in the sewing instructions for each of those months. And so we're gonna get started, and we're gonna start with a couple basic 4 patches, meaning that we're going to sew a couple squares together and then sew a couple more of them together as well. All right. And the most effective way that I get this done is that I'm going to start sewing my blocks together with some background. All right. And here's the deal. Ladies and gentlemen, I do not cut any of my fabric for my months prior to stream. I will only, on stream. I cut them always prior to stream because I would like you to purchase the pattern and have them prepped before we do our sewing. The monthly streams that we're doing here are going to be tips and tricks on how to actually assemble all of the blocks. So for our first pieces, we're going to get started. We're going to sew our fabric B and background squares together. And knowing that we have 2 9 patches to sew for this, we are going to sew together several. All right. And one thing that you'll want to make sure that you're doing, I'll show you what I'm going to do in a second. One of the things I want to make sure that you guys are keeping an eye out on is your 1/4 inch seams. And one thing I forgot to mention before I started sewing, I don't write my patterns in web piecing 100%. So what we'll do here is I'll show you kind of how I web piece these little 4 patches together. So that first block that we have, which is just fabric B and background, will look like so. And we actually made 2 of them, so I already put 2 of those together. Or their background difference, like so. I'm going to sew these 2 together, these 2 together. And so when I go through the machine, one's going to have the white on top and one is going to have the print on top. And then when I cut the pieces apart, I can cut this block apart and then sew the center seam. All right. You don't necessarily need to do this because you could theoretically just sew a white and a fabric B together 4 times and sew them apart. So the first 2, I didn't actually do that correctly. I did that backwards. So you can sew them pieces like this, press them open and sew them together. Or if you web piece, this is the direction and orientation. You go ahead and you can press them in the correct ways and sew them together that way. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and press these. So there's a couple different 4 patches here. You have a fabric B and a background, a fabric C and a background, and you will also have a fabric B and C 4 patch. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about pinning. I do pin, but I don't pin a ton. So I pin on areas where I find it very important for my seams to nest or for my seams to align. So if I was not pressing my seams to one direction and I was pressing my seams open, you want to make sure that your seam, where these 2 align, are perfect. So you definitely want to pin there. When you're nesting, you can kind of feel when you put the 2 pieces together, how they interlock with each other, like so, okay? And then I'm gonna sew my 1/4 inch on this side. Wait a second. I think I actually sewed that backwards. I did, because we want, it's okay. It doesn't really matter. You can rotate them. So did you see what I just did? I stopped that because I thought I went the wrong direction, but the seam can just be on the vertical. If you wanted it to be exactly like the other side, I would have sewn on the other horizontal. But with 4 patches, you can also rotate your blocks the 90 degrees to get where you need it to go. So for web piecing, like I just did here, I essentially do not cut them apart, and I leave a little bit of thread in the middle. And that way, I know exactly how the pieces are supposed to go together. This is how I love web piecing, is because now when I put these together, I'm going to sew where my web chain piecing thread is. So it's going to be on that side versus sewing the other one. Because if I sew the other side, I'm not going to be able to open this block up and you're going to be like, oh yeah, whoops, I sewed on the wrong side. But this really helps on larger or more complicated blocks or pieces to make sure you're always sewing the correct direction. And it also helps make sure that you don't swap 2 blocks in the wrong spot. I'm going to go ahead and iron these up. Like so. All right, so that's one of the 4 patches. And notice this one looks a little different, but if I rotate it 90 degrees, my fabric swatches land in the same spot as the other one. So, like so. Ta-da. Okay. Now we have our fabric B and background 4 patches. We are going to make some fabric C and background 4 patches, right? And so now we're going to say, okay, we have them here like so and like this. And so now I'm going to sew these top 2 together, the bottom 2 together, and then sew the long piece. Now when I sew the 2 pieces together, I could theoretically cut and then sew the block together immediately. But since I know I need 2, hey Tessa! And since I need 2, I'm just going to go ahead and sew the second set as well. All right, so my second set looks like so. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and sew those together. Are we doing closed seams? So I am pressing towards one direction. And I am pressing towards one direction because I'm okay with clashing seams. You can press your seams open if you want your pieces and your blocks to not have any clashing seams. All right. So now that I have my fabric C in background, I know these are 4 patches. So instead of cutting all of them apart, I'm just cutting the blocks apart. So I have my 2 and my other 2. So the pattern itself says, you know, you can follow the pressing instructions, but know that the pressing instructions may give you some clashing seams. Again, I don't mind it, especially with batik fabrics. I don't think that it matters. My batik fabrics are really, they press really flat. So to me, it doesn't make a difference. Clashing seams or not, it doesn't bother me. If it really bothers you, press seams open. Oh, you know what? That's a problem. I accidentally sewed 2. Do you see that? I'm going to have to unstitch that. Whoopsies. I haven't done that in a while, where I've pressed 2 batik fabrics. Well, as I'm talking about batik fabrics and them being very thin, you have to be careful. You only pick one. I also realize I need to grab some fork pins for later, so we'll grab those later, but I'm going to go ahead and unstitch this real quick. Gotta love the fact that I did that on the first stream. So, you know, I meant to do that. Batik fabrics are thin, and you want to make sure you grab only one. Whoopsies. All right, so the 4 patches are pretty early. Pretty early in the pattern, and I actually have the pattern open, so I'm going to try to follow the pattern as best as possible. What I do find as a personal, I'm going to sew this block together, as I sometimes do jump around just given what I like to work on, but there's a method to the madness when I write my pattern, so I'm going to try to follow that as best as possible. I am making essentially all of the 4 patches of this block first, so we make sure that we solidify that skill. The other thing that you should be fairly careful about are your seam allowances. So you want to make sure that you have a good, accurate 1/4 inch seam. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and sew that down again. All right, now we're going to press this, and then we'll actually have 2 halves. And I'll show you how I pin. So I use these clover fork pins. They're super handy. You nest your seams together. And then you use your fork pin and you pin on either side of the seam. Now, if you were pressing your seams open, you would absolutely need to make sure everything aligns correctly when you're pinning them down. The fork pins being on either side make it so your pieces pretty much do not move. And I slow down when I approach the fork pin. If you hit the fork pin going full speed, you will potentially break your needle and potentially throw your machine out of time. Sometimes for these smaller web pieces, because they're connected, I don't actually pin. I just hold my seams and call it good. But that is a personal preference. That is, if you would like to pin as much as you like, go for it. Sometimes I do find over pinning is a little bit of a problem, and it gives me a little bit more wiggle, especially if you are not an accurate pinner. Okay, so we have those. And we are here. All right, so we have our 2 background and fabric C 4 patches. All right, and then now we have a fabric B and C 4 patch, and this one is going to be a little bit more. You want to be a little bit more careful. It doesn't actually matter. You can rotate them. I say that, and then it doesn't matter. You can rotate them 90 degrees if you need to. Hi, Deanne. How are you? Happy Saturday. So for our mix 4 patch, we're going to sew the top 2 together, the bottom 2 together, and then sew our line together. And I like web piecing a lot because this helps me not mess things up and have to do some funky things, especially as the blocks get bigger. And when I mean bigger, I mean like more pieces. Because if it was more than 4 pieces, it gets a little bit harder to keep track of everything going on. And we will have, oh, hi Leslie. And we will have more practice with web piecing come month 3 and 4. Month 2, it's not so much web piecing, it's a lot of chain piecing. But month 3 and 4, we will have a lot more to go on. All right. So, ta-da! Oops, flip those apart. We're going to go ahead and, nest our seams and sew this block together for the center. Again, you can pin it if you'd like. This block isn't super big, and I like to make sure my seams are nested, and then I just hold the seams together. But I am also I'm a lazy pinner. I'll press this open. So now we have 5 4 patches. We have a BC, we have 2 C background and 2 B backgrounds, okay? And then the next step is to make our flying geese, all right? And our flying geese are made from fabric A and these really big background squares. Now, these are stitch and flip corners. I like using our clearly perfect angles on the bed of our machine for smaller squares. These are kind of big, right? So if I do these on a diagonal, you can kind of see where the end of the corner, you can't even see it on my monitor anymore, is off my bed of my machine. And therefore, for these specifically, I like marking the diagonals. If it goes off the bed of the machine, it makes it really difficult to make sure that you're staying straight as you're sewing that line. And so it is a little bit easier to just mark the larger lines, or the lines on the larger squares, versus using the clearly perfect angles. Okay. And since my ruler is just shy, I essentially align it with that 45-degree line. We'll mark where we're at, and then follow up that line all the way up. Okay, like so. And we are going to do that 8 different times. So this block, making traditional flying geese this way is a little bit easier. If I wanted to make the 4 at a time flying geese, because this flying geese is so large, it makes my squares that I would need super big. And it almost makes it more difficult because making squares or cutting squares that are gigantic is actually fairly difficult with the standard set of rulers that most people have in their sewing kits. So I use a Frixton pen to mark my diagonals These come off on with the iron, but they do come back with cold water or cold temperatures. So I only really like using Frixton pens marking lines or things that are on the inside of the quilt, or things that are going to be in the seam allowances. If they are not in the seam allowance and they mark on the, if you mark them on the exterior of your quilt, you do run the risk of the lines showing back up when you least expect them to show back up. And unfortunately, that would be really bad, especially if this is a show quilt or something like that. Last one we're going to mark. We are going to sew 4 of them on to the rectangle, which is going to be one side of the flying geese. Cut, press, and then sew the next 4 onto the other side of the rectangle. I don't know what to do with my ruler. All right. So we have these big flying geese rectangles that we're going to be doing stitch and flip corners to. And that stitch and flip corner, what that means is I'm going to align it to the short side for the flying geese. And for my flying geese, I will sew directly on this line. I'm going to ignore my clearly perfect angles right now because these blocks are too big for them. And I'm going to sew on this line. And I'm going to do that 4 different times for my 4 big flying geese that I'm going to need. You could theoretically rotate this 90 degrees, 90 degrees and sew this direction. It depends on what you like to do or what side of the flying geese you want to start on. But with flying geese that are just the normal triangle, you can start on either side. Things with flying geese that I need to tell you guys about. I don't always do this, but this is one of those. If you are a newer quilter and you are unsure of your quilting skills, or you would like to be more precise, one of those do as I say, not as I do sort of things. When you're doing stitch and flip corners, best practice is always going to be, I'm going to just demo this here, is always going to be making sure when you press this corner out, right, this wing covers the rectangle that you just sewed, right? So this is 100% covering. And you want to do that before, this is the kicker, before you trim off the extra triangle. If you do that after you trim off the extra triangle and you realize that your seam allowance, like, let me back up, put that away. Your seam allowance only went up to here and you're like, oh, my rectangle doesn't look like a rectangle anymore. You don't have any way to fix it. So you always want to press at least one of them out. Make sure that this is still the correct rectangle size that you have before you trim off this excess, okay? Best practice for those of you that are newer quilters to do that for every single one, all right? Just doing it for one doesn't necessarily mean that you sew the same on every single one. So say like you've done that. I'm gonna go ahead and cut the other 3 because I'll cut all of these at the same time too. Pretend that I did that for these 3, because by this point, I've done it enough to know that I am close enough. I'm going to use my 1/4 inch on my ruler on the seam line. Hey, Treewood! And I'm going to go ahead and lop off that excess, right? So this extra triangle is spare fabric. You can make whatever the heck you want with it. Okay, I'm going to do that the 4 different times. And then now that we have those cut, we're going to go ahead and press them open to make it back to the size of a rectangle. Okay. So now we have our big block, our big rectangle block, like so. Okay. So we should have 4 of those. If you sewed it the other direction and your triangle happens to be on this bottom side, that's okay too. Really, what you're going to do is you're going to finish the flying geese by sewing the opposite side. Regardless if you sew the left or the right hand side first, it doesn't really matter in this case. I just naturally sew the right side of the flying geese first. It's habit for me. And then therefore, as you probably will find out, unless I have to do it the other way to make some modified flying geese, I always sew the right ones on, and I tell the reader or the person making my pattern to sew the right side as well. All right. So now that we have these, we're going to take our squares that we have left that we've marked, and we are going to sew the other side. Okay. So we're going to align it to the left side with the diagonal making a triangle, like so, right? That diagonal makes like a triangle here. So you don't want to make a sewing line from corner to corner this way, because if you look at that, that's going to be like a parallelogram. You want to make a triangle. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and start sewing this side. And I'm sewing on the line. Do that again. Make sure that it's not a parallelogram, but a triangle. Parallelogram, a triangle. And last one. And what we're going to do, like we did the other one, is we're going to go ahead and double check that our seam was on the right spot. So we're going to go ahead and press this open. And we're going to say, okay, yeah, that looks like the rectangle that I had, right? Like I don't see anything funky. If I flip it over, I don't see anything green on the other side, meaning I sewed too far away from that diagonal line. So I think that looks good. I'm gonna grab my cutting mat again, my rotary cutter, and my ruler, and I'm going to cut off the extra. But make sure you unfold this before you cut off the extra, because otherwise you're going to cut off both sides and you're not going to be happy. So, I'm going to cut off the excess here, like so. And pretend we are doing that for all of the other pieces as well, or we've double checked our seams. All right, so now that we've done that, we are going to go ahead and press these open to finish out the flying geese. So, once we have those done, and we have our flying geese, it's time to put the block together, right? Well, the centerpiece of our block isn't quite finished, so we actually need to finish the center block. We are going to take that center block, and we are going to sew it with some other squares and rectangles to make a little block. And one of the things that you can see here is that you can actually maybe see how that could have been two other 4 patches together to make that center block, but I wanted to get rid of some of the seams. Instead of having, seams between all the white rectangles, we are actually going to just make them solid. So, to make our center block, we have our B and C 4-patch. We are also going to utilize 2 extra fabric B and fabric C squares that look like so. Okay, I'm going to see if I can't lay it out here. Like so. All right, and then we're also going to have these white rectangles on all sides. Now, for those of you that have watched me sew quite a bit, you'll know that now we have a grid, and we're going to web piece the center block together. Meaning I'm going to sew column 1 and column 2 together, and then add column 3 before we go ahead and press and sew the center between the rows seams together. And also what's really weird is I'm actually going to sew column 3 to column 2 and then sew column 1 to column 2, 3. And the reason why I do that is I like being able to put the smaller piece on top. And if I sewed column 2 on column 1, it's the larger piece on top. So then it looks kind of funky. So regardless, web piecing, all you're trying to do is make sure that things are going in the right order and the right direction. So you just want to be careful when you're adding that 3rd column that you're adding it in the correct orientation. And that you haven't messed up what direction your blocks are supposed to go. It makes it a little easier on this block because you have the same fabric running on the diagonal. So you have the same block running on the diagonal here versus the other one. So now I'm going to rotate 90 degrees. It's a little easier to do when I put it on the design wall. But like putting this here doesn't make any sense because I remember I said everything on the diagonal is the same. So this needs to be fabric C. Then you have your background, and then the bottom piece has your fabric B down here that you can't see. There you go. So we're going to do that. I'm not going to cut the other pieces apart. So this is kind of the trick and beauty of web piecing, is that way, once I get everything webbed, it makes it so if I drop my quilt top or if I drop something, it doesn't matter. Things are always going to be in the same spot, and you're not going to forget how that quilt top or how that block was supposed to go together, what order were my pieces supposed to go at all. It just works. I can tell you nothing is more frustrating until you like finish the entire quilt top assembly or block assembly, and then you realize that you turned a piece or you flipped two pieces. Because I've done both. It's not great. It's not fun. And there's a lot of unpicking and a lot of cursing that goes on to unpick that block out or blocks out, restitch, and get it all going. So now we have our center block that is all kind of sewn together, right? So if I like toss this around, shook this around, nothing is falling apart because everything is still sewn together. If I were to drop this, this block is still sewn together. I will say one thing, if you are pressing your seams open, web piecing works to an extent. After you sew the long rows together, you'll have to go in and snip your web piecing, chain piecing links, because once you want to press the long seam open, you're going to realize that you have thread that's kind of holding them shut. So you'll want to go through and snip those apart. And I'll explain that when we are ready to press the long seams of this center block. Okay. I'm pressing these in. But just to be fair, I am essentially pressing my seams to one direction. I'm following the pressing instructions in the pattern, and that is because if I'm using batik fabrics, it's really thin. It is not necessary to be nervous that I'm going to have clashing seams. My clashing seams are not going to be super bothersome since the batiks are pretty flat and pretty thin. It's more that the fact that they're flat than they're thin is the reason why I like I don't mind clashing seams. If the pieces don't press flat, when you have a whole bunch of seams all together, you will see a noticeable bump in your block. But the fact that batiks press flat, it's not a big deal. All right, so now that you have your seams, you can see that right there, you have two seams where they're gonna nest on either side of that center block. You can go ahead and kind of get where they're supposed to go. I start from the end of the block, so this is the first time that they'll nest. I'm going to take my pin and I'm going to pin these together like so. And I'm going to do that same thing for the other side. You can do this for both sides of the block right now because this block isn't a 9 patch where everything's the same, where like if I fold this over, it wouldn't have been a problem to sew on that bottom line. So I can actually pin the other side of this block right now too. If they were all the same size, I would warn you not to do that because then you end up with like a whole bunch of fluff in the middle. I would say just sew one side, then pin the other one before you sew. But because this one, the block is wide enough where you won't have any interferences from the edges, you can go ahead and pin both sides. Fix that iron like so. Okay. So now that I have those pinned, I'm going to go ahead and sew. I do sew pretty quickly, and then I'll slow down when I get to the pin, and I do sew over my pins. If you hit your pins going jackrabbit speed or the fastest speed, you will break your needle, you will throw your machine out of time. But I find the fork clover pins, if you slow down, you can sew straight over them. And even if your needle does tend to hit it at a slower speed, it'll just glide right over it or slide off the side. All right. So now I'm going to go ahead and press this block. And one thing that I will say for this block is now you have your big center block, right? And you have your 4 patches for your corners, and your flying geese now are your sides instead of your white rectangles like your center block. So we're going to do the same thing that we just did for this center block for the entire block of this quilt, or the entire block, right? So this is the center block. We have our 9 patches, right? Like I said, our same fabric print is going to go diagonal across your quilt block. And so that kind of helps you with your orientation, right? So regardless of which way you turn this, it doesn't matter. I know that this block is going to go here like this. And then in this corner, it's going to go in that same diagonal, right? So it's going to look like that. Because I'm going to web piece this, I'm going to go ahead and say, okay, cool. I know my flying geese are going to make it look like a star, right? So my top piece is going to look like so. My bottom is going to be 180, and this one's going to go rotate 90 degrees. And I also know my first piece in this corner is going to be this blue, right? Be blue, blue, blue. It's not going to be blue this way, right? Do you see that? It's not going to be blue that way. It's got to go diagonal. So it's going to be blue in that direction, okay? So this is how I'm doing this with a smaller space and no design wall. Typically, I would highly recommend you having a design wall or a design board. But if you don't have one of those, that is a really good way to think about this block. Okay. I'm going to sew those down. And now I have my center block, right? And my center block, I know that I'm still going to have this one here. And so I'm going to go ahead and place my flying geese across my center block. And I'm going to sew that seam. And then on the bottom. Now, here's where you're like, okay, so which way does it go? Is it this way? Is it this one? We know it's going to be this guy here, right? So I can kind of look. All right, so the block above it has them from upper left to bottom right. So upper left to bottom right is correct. And then I also have my block for this guy, for the star, right? So I know the star, the base of the star goes towards the center block, so it has to go this direction. I'm going to fold this over. And we're going to sew this together. So effectively, I'm sewing column 2 and column 3 together. Right? So that's kind of the block so far, right? It's half the block that we've made all the way down. Now, I'm going to rotate this 180 degrees, and I'm like, okay, well, I got to sew the other side now, right? So the other side, now I know the blue also still needs to continue in that diagonal. So that's how I know that this one's going to be the one on top. And we're going to sew those two together. And then for the center block, I know I have to have the star piece with the flying geese kind of making the star points. So it's going to look like that. The last corner is going to be the other shells, right? So this is going to be fabric B. And if I look at the center block, I know that that diagonal goes this direction. And I'm going to sew that block to that bottom row. Okay, so right now I have my block pretty much web pieced. I need to press them, and then I need to sew the long seams together. But this is kind of what that block looks like. Now we are going to go ahead and press our seams in the correct direction. Oops. Give me 1 second. And then we'll sew the long seams together. I will absolutely be using our fork pins in this case because this is a pretty long seam. It's about 24 inches, a little more than 24 inches. So we'll want to make sure that those long seams stay connected in the correct spot. I am pressing everything towards our flying geese blocks. And if you are pressing them, oops, I forgot to mention that. If you are pressing your seams open on the web piecing portion, I'll show you guys this. If I wanted to press this open right here on the back, I flipped it. This is the center block. I forgot to mention this. If I wanted to press this seam open, you'll find that I have my chain piecing thread right here. That's going to prevent me from really pressing that seam open right now. So you'll have to go through and snip those if you are web piecing and wanting your seams to be pressed open. All right. So let me press the rest of this block. And I like everything in this case right now because I can drop it, I can do whatever, I can stop sewing if somebody called me or if I had to go take a break or something happened. I can always come back and know exactly where I am. And I'm at a good stopping point if I needed to, you know, go do something else for a little bit. Okay. I'm pressing that towards the exterior or the flying geese block. I'm going to do that same thing on this side as well. And I'm going to rotate this 180 so I can press the other rows. Again, this pattern I think is a confident beginner. I think if you have the motivation to want to make this quilt pattern, I think I can arm you with the tools and knowledge to make it successfully. I know a lot of folks look at some of my block and month patterns and are like, there are a lot of points. And you know what? There are. Some of them matter more than others. And some of them, if you cut it off, no one's going to notice. So for this long seam, I start from the back and I will nest this seam together at the block, and I will pin that because honestly that's the part that matters here. And I'll go to where that center block and that corner piece meet, and I'm going to pin that as well. And honestly, if you do something funky in the middle of this, no one's going to know. As long as you hit this seam nesting and this seam nesting, your block will look fine. You can pin more. That's not a big deal. You can pin more. You can pin as much as you like. It's not necessary. All right. Other side. I'm going to do the same thing because I haven't sewn yet, right? Because the edges are in the middle of this block. It's not anywhere else. So I'm going to go ahead and pin the other side. Align the raw edges together and pin. I pin on either side of that seam, and honestly that really holds your block together and I know it won't move. I'm going to go ahead and nest to this side correctly. And pop that pin in and we're good to go. So now we're going to sew. All right, we're going to have 2 long seams to sew and month 1 is going to be finished. Again, slow down as you get to your pins, and then kind of realign your piece. And then I go again. You let your machine do the work. And all you're doing is just guiding your fabric. Slow down when you get to the pin. And if you see here, I'm not really aligned. I'm going to go ahead and realign to the end of my fabric. Okay. But because I haven't actually started sewing this part, that pin is holding everything in place, right? So I theoretically could have sewn this whole thing with this piece like that. It doesn't really matter. It's just once we get to this side of the pin, we want to make sure this block is aligned to the raw edge. All right. So we have one side down. Take the pins out. I'm going to rotate this 180 because since we've already pinned the other side, we're going to go ahead and sew the other side together. Align the raw edges, make sure that everything is good, and start sewing. So I'm at the next pin. I'm going to go ahead and slowly stitch over the pins. And finish out that block. Take these pins out. And now I'm going to go ahead and press my seams, my long seams. And month 1 block is actually complete. Now, we only have 1 block to make in month 1. All right, so it took me about an hour talking through how to sew this block. It may take you a little bit longer. Month 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 will take a little bit longer. So just know that that is the case. We are going to be doing some repetitive skills in 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 as well. And so that part of it will be kind of fun. We'll be building on your sewing skills, and by the end of the block of the month or program, you'll have a really amazing quilt. And I'm going to be making it along with you. So next month, on the second Friday, I will be posting the tips and tricks for month 2, and then I will be showcasing the video on the following Saturday. Same time here at 1:30. And month 2 is probably one of the hardest blocks. So I will give you guys that warning now. I have tons of tricks and help for those blocks. But here is month 1. It's a 24-inch block finished, which is fairly large. You can kind of see that here. It doesn't quite fit into the field of view. But this is month 1. Oops. Nice and simple. No super extra tools in case of this one. But I will see you guys here next month for month 2, and we'll be starting to work on the snails that go around that center of the quilt. So actually I can show you, and this is probably a little easier. There's little snail corners around, oops, there we go, around here. All right. Well, I hope you enjoyed this kind of step through for month 1, and I will see you guys next month. Have a great rest of your Saturday, and I'll talk to you guys later. If you have any other help or need any other questions, you can find me on Instagram, Facebook, Patreon, Discord, Twitch, or message me on Etsy. Pretty much any of them. I check all of the different social media places, and I will talk to you guys soon. Bye!